好，各位同事早晨。今次呢就係
Good morning, members. This is a Bills Committee on Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Financial Institutions Amendment Bill 2017 and Companies Amendment Bill 2017. This is the first meeting. So first of all, we need to elect a chairman, Mr. Christopher Chung. I nominate Mr. Wong Ting Kwong, seconded by Mr. Ronick Chan. Do you accept, Mr. Wong? Yes, I do. Any other nominations? I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Mr. Wong Ting Kwong, please come up. Thank you. This is Anti-Money Laundering, AML, and Counter-Terrorist Financing Financial Institutions Amendment Bill 2017 and Companies Amendment Bill 2017. First, I would like to ask, do we need an election of the Deputy Chairman? I'll have to learn from Mr. To. I'll count to 3. 1, 2, 3. No such suggestion. Please ask the administration to come in to join us. It's a full team.
Okay. 各位早晨啊。
Good morning, everyone. First, can we ask the administration to present the 2 bills, and then we will ask questions. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to give you information about the legislative background and intent of the 2 bills. At the beginning of this year, we have briefed members of the Financial Services Panel of our idea. Then we embarked on a public consultation. Over a few months, we talked to the trade, we talked to legislators, and we address suggestions given to us by members of the public. Today we're here to present to you the 2 bills. First is the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Financial Institutions Amendment Bill 2017, the AML Bill. The second one is Companies Amendment Bill 2017. We propose that these 2 bills are scrutinized in the same Bills Committee because the legislative intent is to fulfill Hong Kong's international obligation under the Financial Action Task Force. We have to implement relevant international standards. On top of that, we have to plug the gap of inadequacies in the regulatory regime. First, some background information about the FATF, Financial Action Task Force. Hong Kong is one of the rare places where we participate as a member, as a city. Members of the FATF will have to implement standards and measures to fight money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. We have been a member since 1990 1990 and 1991. We will implement the standards. We take into account of practices adopted by other members, and we aim to try to strike a balance. Our goal is to consolidate Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. We have put in place a framework to combat illicit activities. And we also would like to enhance the accountability of Hong Kong enterprises, as well as creating a business environment in Hong Kong that is effective to fight against money laundering and counter-terrorist financing, to encourage clean operation and stability. Our framework is all in all quite sound. However, because of increasing risks of AML and CTF, the standards have been evolving very quickly. We have recently conducted a gap analysis to see the deficiencies in our current regulatory framework that may render us ineffective to combat illegal activities. One of the bills we have presented today is to address a deficiency, which is the absence of statutory customer due diligence and record-keeping requirements for designated non-financial businesses and professions. I will go into details of the definition of this group of people. On top of that, well, there is no adequate information of owners of beneficial interest. They include, say, for example, secretaries and board members. There is information, but not the information of the genuine beneficial owner. There is a gap that we have identified. And the FATF is of the view that we have fallen short. And in a peer review conducted in 2008, it was clearly stated that Hong Kong is expected to address such inadequacies or deficiencies. The legislative principle. I have mentioned about some deficiencies in our regulatory framework. However, we need to take into account the impact caused by the implementation of measures and standards. We aim to strike a balance to, at the same time, meet the basic requirements of international standards without causing excessive inconvenience to businesses in Hong Kong. We have taken reference from overseas practices. The FATF requires members to implement international standards. A number of countries, including Singapore, Ireland, UK, Switzerland, have legislate for requirements I have mentioned. We have taken reference from their practice, so that we will not do more than these other countries have done, and while meeting the basic requirements. I will now move on to the content of the two proposed legislative amendments. In relation to the AML and CTF bill, this is to amend the ordinance to include CDD and record-keeping requirements for four trades, four professions, namely solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, and trust or company service providers. These professions, when they engage in specified transactions, will have to abide by and fulfill the requirements under statutory CDD, customer due diligence. Specified transactions include setting up of companies or when handling customers' assets, money, or management of security accounts, customer accounts, as well as purchase of landed properties. The FATF these 4 professions are one of the 6 stated by the FATF. There are also casinos as well as dealers in precious metals and stones. We have conducted an assessment. We are of the view that, first of all, we don't have casinos in Hong Kong. And when it comes to dealers in precious metals and stones, from the information we have obtained from the police in the past 5 years, there is very little cash transactions. And this profession does not have a self-regulatory regime. So we do not propose to include dealers in precious metals and stones. Well, for the 4 professions, namely solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, and trust or company service providers, the first 3, that is, solicitors, accountants, and real estate agents, have respective ordinances and regulatory bodies governing them. Our proposal is to use their respective regulators under their ordinances to ensure that these practitioners will meet the requirements. Well, these are the Law Society, the Hong Kong ICPA, that is the Hong Kong Institute of Certified Public Accountants, and the Estate Agent Authority, EAA. We'll also leave them to formulate guidelines to meet the statutory CDD and record-keeping requirements. We'll also ask the 3 regulators to put in place a set of disciplinary and sanction measures addressing non-compliance. In short, we only impose the statutory requirements for the 3 professions without adding any more requirements or imposing criminal sanctions. When it comes to trust or company service providers, say for example those providing secretarial services, currently there is no licensing or regulatory regime. If we apply these statutory CDD and record-keeping requirements on this profession, we need at least a register. So we will ask the company registry to formulate a licensing regime for this group of professions. I would like to emphasize that the licensing regime is to ensure that these practitioners will conduct statutory customer due diligence and to meet record-keeping requirements. And this is not to set standards for this profession. And as to whether such providers can obtain a license, it depends on the partner, owner, or directors are fit and proper persons. The fit and proper test will look into whether these people have criminal convictions, whether they have whether they are subjects of liquidations, bankruptcy, winding up, or whether they have flouted requirements in this area.
We'll also ensure that they comply with customer due diligence and also record-keeping requirements. If they breach our requirements, they will face similar administrative sanctions or penalties. So they might be reprimanded, they might have a temporary suspension of license, or they might be fined. There won't be criminal penalties such as imprisonment. So lastly, I'd like to talk about the company's amendment bill. The purpose is relatively simple compared to the first two. In light of FATF requiring each signatory country to strengthen beneficial ownership, transparency, and requiring each signatory keeping records of beneficial ownership. So the company's amendment bill, we require that companies established in Hong Kong, they have to adopt reasonable steps to ensure that persons or entities with significant control, that would include a natural person and a legal entity, then the company needs to issue a notice to confirm certain information, and the company will also need to keep records of the significant control. So we call that a significant controller register. So when the Hong Kong law enforcement agencies, when they target terrorist financing and money laundering, when they conduct investigation and they want to prevent crime or enforce the law, they can retrieve this information from companies in a timely manner. So I need to mention that this recommendation, when we did public consultation, we received quite a lot of feedback saying that keeping a control register, we received a lot of feedback on this register. So if you recall, at the beginning of the year when we met in the financial affairs panel, we had mentioned whether we would allow companies to submit this information to a central registrar and allow the law enforcement agencies or the public to retrieve this information. Or another method was the public could search this information, but during our consultation, the majority of the feedback regarding allowing the public to check the beneficial ownership and the significant control, there was a confidentiality concern because companies might have to deal with a lot of public inquiries. So after considering the public opinion and after comparing to the needs of the FATF, we need to provide timely access to law enforcement agencies to allow them to check the beneficial ownership. So in our bill, we just recommend that the companies need to keep relevant records. They need to compile an ownership significant control register, and when there is a request by the law enforcement agency, they have to allow the law enforcement agencies to check this information, but we do not have arrangements for allowing the public to make this search. Lastly, I'd like to talk about our bill. I talked about the major principles, and we had listed the specific requirements. For example, in the company's registrar, they will provide, there will be specific information requirements required of company service providers, and we'll also have some industry guidelines. And I'm also aware that the registrar has already drafted guidelines, and they are consulting the industry and the stakeholders. Just now I mentioned three industries, the lawyers, the accountants, and real estate agents. I'd like to mention that the lawyers, the Law Society, a decade ago, they already had drafted a industry guideline, and I know that regarding international development, they will amend their guidelines on a regular basis. And in the past, so regarding real estate agents, when they conduct their business, they will also verify customer identity and due diligence. So we are in close contact with them, and they update their guidelines, allowing their frontline staff to comply with the legal requirements. Now, the accountants have also recently issued an industry guideline for its members, and they allow the members to provide feedback. So before I have my colleagues respond to legislators, Hong Kong being a signatory to the FATF next year, at the end of next year, we need to go through the fourth round of peer review, and in that exercise, one of the staff members will be in Hong Kong, and together with my colleagues, I'll have to report to that person regarding Hong Kong's latest status. So during this review, we've seen that other countries, when they do this exercise, they were not able to include the industry's guidelines into the FATF requirement. So there has been a negative impact on the overall rating. So we think Hong Kong will be going through quite a strict review exercise. So if we cannot remedy our shortfalls, we believe that we will be susceptible to a negative review. And the outcome, you would be interested, is that every 6 months we will have to do a follow-up action plan, and if we cannot comply, it's likely that we will be reprimanded and we would be criticized, and that would be negative to our business environment. So I hope that the government, chairman and legislators in the bill committee, we hope that we can work, we can cooperate, and by early next year we can implement these legislative amendments. Thank you, Secretary. Next, we will have our legislators raise questions. Mr. Kwok Wing Hung and then Lim Kin Fong. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the Secretary's brief. We understand that there has been a lot of communication on this issue. This amendment will impact the legal profession, as you said. The legal profession, as you said, we do conduct due diligence, and we do conduct know your customer. We do conduct this type of efforts, and we are doing our job and complying with legal or international requirements. That is important, but we don't want to have an impact on the Hong Kong business environment and have a negative impact on our industry. So, Chairman, would you consider inviting all the professions, including the lawyers, the accountants, the real estate representatives, to have a meeting with deputations and hear from them? At the same time, we can see whether we need to further fine-tune the blue bill and align our efforts with professional development. Mr. Kwok, you are correct. Our next agenda item will be about holding a meeting with deputations. Now, just now I had written down the scope of our invitation, and that includes what you just said, Mr. Lam Kin Fong. Well, inviting the scope, are we just limited to what Mr. Kwok mentioned? Well, even though we did not touch upon the company's bill, but when we're talking about private companies and listed companies, limited companies, unlimited companies, these are all included. So the scope is actually very wide. So if we are to issue an invitation, we should invite as widely as possible. I'd like to ask, in recent years in Hong Kong, we had a lot of mutual tax arrangements with foreign jurisdictions, and the government says that we need to comply with international practice. Well, Hong Kong is a mature international financial center. We're always following other people's footsteps. Are there any areas where we're doing excellent and other people need to make reference to us? Now, in the past, we always say that a lot of other foreign jurisdictions have done a lot, and if we don't follow, we'll get a negative rating, we'll be blacklisted, and so on. I'd like to understand what is the government's view on this. So when we track a beneficial owner or a significant controller in a company, that gives rise to a lot of problems. If you look at the UK, if you open a bank account, it's actually very difficult, especially for certain people. If they operate a company, there are company accounts, and they have to, the investigation might take a whole year, and they can't open an account. In Hong Kong, we talk about difficulties in opening bank accounts. So even for existing accounts, their actual ownership, a beneficial owner or a significant controller, all that has to be traced. All kinds of problems arise out of that. So in this amendment, we do highlight a lot of these problems. So when we trace all this, how far back do we trace? There should be a limit. Another issue is exemptions. Some companies are exempted. So what are the procedures? How do you apply for exemption? And if you don't apply for that, then they are not exempt. And then they are subject to different restrictions. So could the government give us more details on this? Secretary, thank you, Mr. Lam, for your questions and opinions. So first of all, Hong Kong, in our tax regime or anti-terrorist work, are there any areas where we're doing a good job and we can promote ourselves? As I said, well, in AML and CTF, Hong Kong being an SAR, starting from 91, we had signed up with FATF, and it's a very rare incidents where we can sign up as Hong Kong China and be a signatory to FATF. And I was from the 90s. AML and CTF was already an important topic, but you would note that in the last 10 plus years, this risk is becoming higher on people's agenda. So we see more complex company arrangements to raise money and conduct illegal activities. So this is not just limited to FATF. In G20, in the Hangzhou meeting, China has placed a lot of importance on this issue. So I can tell legislators and share with you that our DOJ colleagues and other technical colleagues and members of these international bodies, Hong Kong being a common law regime, we have provided a lot of legal and technical opinion. So if you look at the international standards, it feels like we're catching up. But in our discussions or our meetings, our views are provided and have been adopted, and in terms of fair practice, we have provided feedback to these international associations. So aside from the mutual exchange of tax information, we have issues now arising out of profit sharing and the base tax base. So in as members of the the plenary session and the breakout sessions, we have provided our views. And regarding the difficulty in opening bank accounts,
Well, on different occasions, including in LegCo, in panel meetings, and in answer to members' questions, or when we talk to the trade, we're fully alive to where the problem is. When it comes to international standards and our legal requirements, the tracing of the real beneficial owner and the different layers of ownership. Well, under the law, we require financial institutions to take reasonable steps to do that. So the monetary authority and other regulators formulate guidelines for banks. They put the emphasis on not on de-risking or circumventing risks. When it comes to companies with a global headquarters, they have to meet local legal requirements as well as policies of the whole group. We have to try to find a balance. We explained our requirements, and I know that the Hong Kong MA liaise with banks. So that there will be facilitating measures for account opening, exemptions of companies. Well, under the companies ordinance, we propose a rulemaking power that for companies, save and except listed companies, needs to be exempted. Then we will do it by class and not an individual company. We have to tread very carefully because we have received submissions in the public consultation citing specific examples. However, current international standards don't allow us to exempt a certain class of companies. We don't want to create deficiencies, and we don't want our ratings to be affected in the peer review. Under the Futures and Securities Ordinance, listed companies have to keep a record and disclose information of beneficial ownership. Their requirement is stricter than our proposed requirements. So we have clearly explained to chambers of commerce and associations, and they're fully aware of the requirements. Yes? When it comes to provision of information and opening of accounts, I have heard different views. Just now the PS said that regulation is very important, but they will adopt a reasonable approach to not to impede operation. But what you call reasonable is the highest standard. Yes, it is good. But is it reasonable? Is it reasonableness used reasonably? So banks and the commercial and the business sector express concern. The Hong Kong MA imposes a very stringent requirements, requiring everyone to dot all their I's and cross all their T's. So whilst you put in place a regulatory regime, how do you ensure that the operation will not be affected? Yes, you can explain to them, but I do think there is a problem. You keep talking about being reasonable, but that is not reality. They are scared because when there is irregularity, they will be sanctioned. So how can it be done better? Mr. Lam is right. We know that we need to work harder. There is an emphasis on reasonable measures. That is the requirement of the Hong Kong MA. The Hong Kong MA does not require more than the international standard. It seems that, well, when it comes to difficulties in opening accounts, and they are one or two banks, and they are engaged in the international business. I know that the Hong Kong MA in their publicity and public education promulgated guidelines and they tell banks not to take the stance of de-risking. It has to be risk-based. The Hong Kong MA has liaised with a dozen of banks. They said that they would facilitate opening of accounts by SMEs. I know that a few months ago there was a complaint hotline set up. This is to educate the trade. That if someone encounters difficulties in opening an account, they may reflect to the trade or the Hong Kong MA, and the Hong Kong MA will talk to them. And I will defer to Mr. Stuart McLean from the Hong Kong MA and his team. Hong Kong MA.
First of all, thanks for the question and thanks for raising this. I think it's a very pertinent question. It's an issue that is, as my colleague has said, is very close to the heart of the HKMA, and we've done considerable work, has been said in the last year, to try and address the issue. I think the first point to mention is that the work that we've done suggests that this is an issue, as you said, that is a global issue, because of this issue of reasonableness. The standards that we have set are on a par with those in other jurisdictions, and the issue is about how banks interpret them. And we've done a range of issues, a range of engagements to make sure that we understand the issue and we try and provide guidance and feedback. We've, as I said, as has been said, we have the dedicated website, complaint hotline, and we're monitoring the situation very carefully. We do see signs of improvement in some areas, but we're not out of the woods yet, and we continue to work on this issue. But we do believe some of the measures that have been introduced here may have the chance to actually assist some aspects of the situation. That it's an issue that we continue to work on and is paid close attention to by senior management in the MA.
Okay. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Ronnie Chan, to be followed by Ms. Tanya Chan. Sorry, speaker's microphone is not on. Or when it comes to dealers of precious metal and stones, just now the DS said that well, they don't engage in many cash transactions, so they are not included. When it comes to solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, and trust and company service providers, I don't rule out the possibility that people who engage in money laundering would go to precious metals and stones, thereby changing the ecosystem. Have you set a timetable or a roadmap to say for example, that in 2-3 years' time there will be a review, and if this group exceeds a certain threshold, then they will be included? solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, they are licensed and they are subject to regulation by their own regulators. The trust or company service providers will be subject to a licensing regime. When we look at other jurisdictions, licensing requirements are for these service providers are quite stringent, and the one in Hong Kong is rather lax. So how did you strike a balance? When it comes to the miscellaneous amendments, you said that in order to enhance regulation of certain professions, when it comes to beneficial ownership, well, it will be relaxed from not more than 10% to more than 25%. Well, for a lot of FIs have obtained information for not less than 10%, but now it's relaxed to more than 25%. So some information of some clients will not have to be captured. You can't tell the banks, well, you don't have to get the information anymore. We still have to conduct the CDD. So you might have relaxed the threshold, but we can't just pretend we don't know about a change of beneficial ownership. So how do you strike a balance? Can the administration answer me? I thank Mr. Chen for asking 3 very good questions. First, it's dealers in precious metals and stones. We have 2 considerations. The FATF emphasizes on risk-based approach. This profession is one of the designated non-financial businesses and professions. As I said at the outset, this profession does not pose a high risk on money laundering. We have been monitoring transactions in Hong Kong, and indeed very few of them involve cash. This profession may not be included. In the past few years, well, the amount of transactions involved by this profession is less than 60 transactions, that is less than 0.1%. That is from the information we get from the police. That may be the case, but we will continue to monitor the risk. Next year, we will face a peer review. We will have to satisfy the delegation that not including this profession will not pose excessive risk to us. This profession is different from the other 4. Solicitors, accountants, real estate agents have their own regulators. Dealers in precious metal and stones don't have one. If within a very short time we have to legislate and set up a regulatory regime, we can foresee that it will increase the difficulty. And that's why under our current proposal we have not included them, but we will keep in view their risk. When it comes to the licensing criteria for trust or company service providers, Mr. Chan is right. The current licensing regime is the fit and proper test. When we consulted the trade, there are views saying that we should piggyback on the licensing regime and introduce a professional standard.
So we need to bear in mind that the unit trust and company service providers, there isn't a minimum threshold for entry into this field. So if we have a licensing regime, aside from the fit and proper test, if we were to include thresholds, we'd have to get a consensus from the industry, and new entrants, operators and service providers, they would be denied entry into this industry. So if we just require customer due diligence and records, so companies operating in Hong Kong, operating unit trusts and company service providers, we need to bear these concerns in mind. So in future entry into this field, we will continue to have a discussion with the industry, but as of today, under our AML concerns, we won't have thresholds or into for entry into this field. Now, in the past, regarding thresholds, it's an operational issue that we have discussed with the banks. So, raising the threshold for beneficial ownership from 10% and relaxing it to 25%, this is made with reference to other jurisdictions where in general it's 25%. Of course, in targeting AML and the beneficial ownership, in the past, the bank records, they would keep records of beneficial ownership and the owner, whether they had more than 10%. So that information is held with the banks. Mr. Lam talked about the mutual exchange of tax information. The international standard is 25%. So the Association of Banks, when they exchange information, their feedback was that the threshold is 25%. They wanted us to relax the threshold to 25% when it comes to AML work. So when they keep records and when they have archives, they would like a common standard. So when we align with international practice, it takes time, and we need to communicate with the banks, and we would like to come up with a clear set of standards. Ms. Tanya Chan, it's your turn. You can ask your question and then leave. Well, I have a visit. First of all, I think Ms. Mabel Chan, this is your last day in this post, and tomorrow you'll be Secretary for Transport. I have just one question. You see that FATF, one of their targets is casinos. You mentioned that Hong Kong doesn't have casinos, but Hong Kong has mahjong parlors. So will you deal with them through the company's ordinance, or have you struck a balance with precious metals and gem traders? How won't you deal with them? So I do have my colleagues following up, and I need to meet up with my visit group. I can answer. Mahjong parlors, we clarified that with FATF. It does not come under the definition of casino. So Hong Kong, we do not need to regulate a mahjong parlor. Mahjong parlors are actually mahjong schools. It's regulated by the Education Bureau. Next, Mr. Yu Siweng. Thank you, Chairman. Regarding AML laws, I support that. My first question is, in our regulatory procedure, the penalties that we impose, let's say compared to Singapore, are there any differences? If there's a difference, will it affect overseas investors coming to Hong Kong? Have you done assessment on this? Second, regarding AML on the internet, well, we know that it's quite prevalent. For example, the bitcoins, we see it's very hard to regulate. So if we tighten up in Hong Kong, but if we don't have laws regarding internet AML, there might be loopholes, and AML operators or money laundering operators, they might conduct their activities through the internet in Hong Kong. So do we need to step up regulation in this area? Third question, company service providers. I understand that a lot of companies, let's say in the tourist industry, they are tour agencies, and some tour agencies are for sale. So some people act as agents and help them sell off the company. So will there be a regulation in, will there be a licensing regime, and will this business cease because you need to provide background information, you need to provide financial information, they also need to demonstrate basic skills. So will we see a monopoly arise out of that? Normally this business could be conducted by small businesses, SMEs. Will they be driven out of this market? Have you considered measures to assist them? Secretary, thank you for your 3 questions. First of all, regarding penalties, we mentioned that the 4 industries, 3 of them, the lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents, their self-regulatory regime penalties are administrative measures, including a reprimand, temporary suspension of license, or even a fine. So the FATF, they don't specify the sanctions, but the penalties have to be effective and proportionate. It has to be in line with the offense. Well, we understand in Singapore, in March, they had legislated and they allow the self-regulatory regime to impose penalties, and these are administrative measures. So basically, we're more or less the same. Second, regarding internet laundering, money laundering on the internet, such as, for example, the Bitcoin. This is of concern, and I'm aware that the SFC, they have issued some statements. On an international level, we do keep an eye on cybercrime. FATF has some in-depth studies, and they hope that this FATF member countries can come up with some measures to strengthen our prevention. I'm aware that Hong Kong MA and other regulatory authorities have issued some documents and guidelines regarding cybercrime. So we will keep a close eye on the issue of how to regulate. We need to be careful. We have to consider the public's needs and the public expectations. We need to allow for innovative measures, financial measures, but on the other hand, we need to ensure that we won't increase the risk of money laundering, and we won't increase the risk of terrorist financing. So we need to strike a very careful balance. We need to study and we need to look at how we have to further regulate these industries. Now, our third question was about company service. Just now, Mr. Yu gave a specific example. The company registrar will look into that in depth. I can share with you 2 principles. if a person or a legal entity, they help their clients set up a company, or if they help to secure a premise for the company, or if they recruit directors of the board as a business in Hong Kong. This is a part of a licensing regime consideration. Of course, we have to look at the specifics. The company's registrar will have further discussion with the industry and draft some guidelines such that they can be very clear requirements when a licensing regime would be required. Well, we do have our Mr. Zhong to answer, or Ms. Zhong. Well, company service providers, in our legislation, there is a specified area. For example, the company service provider in Hong Kong, they operate services such as setting up a company. They provide a service or arrange for a person to serve as a director of the board, or as a company secretary, or to serve as a partner, or they help establish a business premise, a business address. That would be the scope of a business company service provider. Now, if it's just a one-off service because of a merger or acquisition, then that would not be within the ambit of our amendment bill. Mr. Yu? Well, if in their purchase and sale, if the composition of the board has changed, if it was a sole ownership and it's now a joint ownership, and in the joint ownership company, the service provider has introduced new shareholders, well, they are selling the company, and in the sale, they provide some support. So in the future, do they require a license for that service? And if they buy and sell a company, if they, let's say they were an onshore company, and after the sale it became an offshore company, so this company service provider would be providing further support. So will they require a license in providing this type of services? Well, if there's a change in the nature of business, this is not relevant. We don't look into that. Put very simply, it would depend on whether during provision of services, was it by way of business they provided this service? Next, what they haven't answered. Ms. Zhong? Thank you, Chairman. So we have to see whether that service was provided by way of business. If it was just one-off, and let's say in the new company they serve as a director, that is also not covered by the scope of this bill. We want to see, is it a provision of services as a business? If there were other transactions where they received a payment, and if it was a business, then they might fall under the scope of our regulation. It would depend on the individual case. Next, Leung Kai-cheng, and then Zheng Wafeng. Well, I'd like to ask, this bill, the Finance Bureau has provided a lot of input. Just now, the Secretary talked about 3 professional bodies, and their penalties are just administrative measures. I understand that, and I also know that your Bureau has looked into these different professional bodies and considered whether the penalties were proportionate and consistent. So I'd like to ask, these 3 professional bodies versus the company service providers. So if the company service provider has breached AML, would it be in proportionate with the other three professional bodies, or would they have separate penalties? Secretary? Thank you, Mr. Leung, for the question. You are familiar with the three professional bodies and the regulatory regime. As a matter of fact, we have had a lot of communication with them. We have communicate with the Law Society. So regarding unit trusts and company service providers, these non-financial institutes, we feel that the risk compared to financial institutions such as banks and securities companies, the risk is not as high. So we feel if we, under our existing regulatory regime, the administrative measures are sufficient. And similarly, with the unit trust and service providers, when we set up a licensing regime under the company's registrar, the penalties and sanctions will be in line or proportionate to the three professional bodies.
In other words, the sanctions include censure, suspension of license, or fines. And the level will be the same as accountants. That is a maximum of $500,000. So there is no criminal sanction. I have another follow-up question. Some professionals, say for example, Institute of Chartered Secretaries in Hong Kong, I am aware that when you drafted this bill, you talked to them. To include them by way of self-regulation, but it is silent in this bill. From my recollection, there is no ordinance regulating chartered secretaries. Is that why you changed your mind? Mr. Leung is right. I mentioned about solicitors, accountants, and real estate agents. There are three regulators, and these three regulators are supported by the respective ordinances. When it comes to chartered secretaries, and there is no dedicated ordinance or regulators. In relation to the organization, Mr. Leung mentioned, yes, we have spoken to them a lot. We have also talked to trustee associations and the Association of STEP. There is no one single organization that represents the entire profession. Of course, that the existing organization is still quite representative, but that is not the only representative organization of the profession. So this is only a licensing regime. It is not a regulation on standards of practitioners. A last question. I would like to ask the company registrar. Well, how much more manpower would you need to implement these two bills? Our initial assessment tells us that we'll need about 60 people. We will follow the existing internal mechanism to ask for additional resources. Mr. Christopher Zhang to be followed by Mr. Chen Kim-po. Thank you. I see that the business sector has used a lot of time and effort to meet requirements related to tax, account opening, and anti-money laundering. If you go to open a bank account, you will need to fill in statements and forms for easily 2 hours. So when it comes to exchange of information for tax and any money laundering, well, they find it quite cumbersome to meet all these requirements, and in a way it has affected the business environment. Yes, counter-terrorist financing is a serious issue, but we don't see any urgency in Hong Kong that warrants strictly following the international standard. I want to ask, how serious is money laundering in Hong Kong? Can you give me some figures? Mr. Yiu mentioned about change in technology, say for example virtual currency, Bitcoin, and its transaction platform. Some financial institutions said that they would look into setting up a Bitcoin transaction platform. So when it comes to this bill, the AML CTF bill, are there provisions or measures targeting virtual currency transactions to stop it being used in money laundering? Yes, I thank Mr. Zheng for his two questions. First, business impact and risk we face. Well, the impact on business, say for example requirements on tax and AML and CTF, we're aware of that. In the past few years, apart from legislation, we have also adjusted our pace. We hope that, we will closely monitor the international arena. We will not be the forerunner, but we should not give the impression that we lag behind. So we will take into account other jurisdictions. We are an international financial center, so we have to keep in view other international financial centers. If they have implemented measures, then we will face tremendous pressure. We have to amend the rules and the trade has also enhanced their ability to prevent risk. I ask the trade to be understanding. Since we have the AML-CTF ordinance, we have been receiving reports on suspicious transactions on different areas. Between 2011, well, at that time there are about 20,000 reports of suspicious transactions every year, and in 2012 it has increased to 76,000, that is to 2015. Most of them are related to the banking sector, and quite a number of them are related to securities and currency service providers, say for example remittance. With the implementation of ordinances and measures, practitioners will be more aware of the requirements. They will report to their superior, and then the company will report to Customs and Excise or the police. This problem is not unique to Hong Kong. It's a global problem. Now, Bitcoin. We will see where we need to strike a balance when it comes to regulation and facilitation. As I said, the SFC have made statements related to Bitcoin that may involved in collateral investment scheme or securities. Currently, we attach a lot of importance to public education. There may be cases of fraud and cases when clients' money are kept, so we have to step up public education. You said that from 2011, 20,000, it has jumped to 76,000 in 2016. So how many of these reports are substantiated? Securities companies or companies may report everything in order to protect themselves, thereby increasing the compliant cost. And this may not be reflected in the figure, how serious money laundering is in Hong Kong. Mr. Jones, right? Frontliners would be inclined to making reports. There is a joint organization, including the police and other regulators. When we receive suspicious transaction reports, we will categorize them and investigate into them. In 2016, we have investigated into 96 cases. Some of them are followed up by sanctions or disciplinary measures. Some of the cases are being followed up. The number of suspicious transactions cannot tell us whether there are incompliances. Following up and investigations are very important. Mr. Chen Kim-po, in order to meet requirements of anti-money laundering, we have to put in place some measures, and of course I support these two bills. The question is how to make the compliance cost bearable and how to keep it to a minimum and how to ensure that these measures are practicable. I know that you have made some amendments in view of views received from the public consultation. Are there issues that the trade has a very strong view, but you are unable to address these concerns? There are a number of areas we have received the strongest voice when it comes to keeping of information of beneficial ownership. I said that when we were conducting the public consultation, in view of changing or evolving international standards, a lot of countries have made the information of beneficial ownership public. So we have included that in our public consultation. Well, the majority of views express reservation in this regard. But the register of a significant controller will be kept by the company at a designated place or a designated intermediary, say for example accountants or lawyers, and only law enforcement officers under specified circumstances may inspect the register. When it comes to keeping the register, there are two views. One saying that the nuisance should be kept to a minimum. When we issue notices to companies to confirm significant controllers, our original intent is that if they have a reasonable belief that someone is a beneficial owner. Well, we send it to beneficial owners. We send it to those who have reasonable belief that some people are beneficial owners. And also the third group is some people who may know that certain people are beneficial owners. We do realize that it's a bit of a nuisance, so we would not issue notices to the third group.
Now, regarding trusts and business service providers licensing regime, we received some feedback that there are a lot of these company secretary service companies, and if they have to apply before they can operate a business, it would affect the business operations. So our legislative recommendation is, first, we will have deeming provisions. That is, any trust or business service provider, before the legislation takes effect, on the date of commencement or before date of commencement they were operating, we will assume that they could have received this license until they declare that they won't make an application. Then we will suspend the license. The second, we will have a transition period. We will allow them to apply for a license within a certain period. Our original intention was 90 days. Now, in light of the public feedback, we will extend it from 90 days to 120 days. So we feel that has met their concern. Next, Chairman, I'd like to follow up. Of course, we welcome this discretion or flexibility, but how do you know what you've allowed the industry to do complies with FATF? What gives you this confidence to allow for this flexibility? Well, there are two areas regarding the international standard regarding beneficial owners. The standards state very clearly that the beneficial ownership information has to be available timely to the law enforcement agencies, and there is no international requirement of calling for a central registrar or making it open to the public. But we understand the international standards are one thing, and quite a few jurisdictions, such as the UK, for example, they are quite ahead of times. They have a central registrar. And we note that aside from UK, the EU, they are also proposing beneficial ownership information can be exchanged mutually. So we need to keep abreast of development. Our current legislative recommendation meets the international requirement, basic requirement, and we can meet the basic requirement. But if international standards or practice advance further, then Hong Kong needs to pay close attention. So the information that we have now does not allow for mutual exchange. We'll have to consult further with the industry, and we'll also have to undergo legislative procedures. Mr. Holden Chow, and then Mr. Wu Jiwai. Thank you, Chairman. I do have a few questions. First, referring to the document, we have two types of people that need to register. Now, some companies, if you trace it down to the natural person, the actual beneficial owner could be a natural person, then I would like to ask, this amendment, the person that has to register, you'll have to trace it all the way down to a natural person. So you have to fill in these two pieces of information. It has to be traced down to the natural person. In the past, there was a common arrangement. A lot of companies, they would ultimately be held by British Virgin Island beneficial owners. In the past, these companies, you couldn't trace their shareholders or the beneficial owners and so on. Of course, unless the shareholders mentioned that. So I want to ask, recently, the BVI arrangement, has that changed? For example, in the future, after this amendment, even these companies who hold BVI companies, they can still be traced. We can still trace the beneficial owner. That's what I want to clarify. The third question is, I see in the document, if the applicable companies' details are made known, then they have to register within 7 days. They have to register with the SCR, the Significant Controllers Register. So this 7-day period, wouldn't that be a little bit short? Could you extend it? Of course, I see that that the person has to be made aware, and then they have to confirm that, and then register that information with the register. So when you say 7 days, I'd like to clarify what you mean, because if it's too short, it seems like a very cumbersome burden. So 7 days, they might not even be made aware. But if they don't take action, they would have breached the law. That might be a little bit too stringent. I want to clarify that. Secretary, hang on. Let me remind legislators. You shouldn't mix English and Chinese. It would be very difficult for the interpreters to handle. Okay, Secretary? Thank you for your reminder. 3 questions. First question, even though I responded with body language, I need to have it on record. We need to give a complete response. The FATF regarding the definition regarding beneficial ownership and regarding a significant controller, it can be a natural person or a legal entity. Our requirement now regarding the records and archives of beneficial ownership. So if a natural person has more than 25% share ownership, they have to register that ownership. And at the same time, we have to trace back ultimately the significant controller owner, the natural person who has the significant controlling interest. So the company, the parent company, and on top of that, the natural person, and ultimately the natural person who has the significant controlling interest. Now, for other jurisdictions, it's more complex. They require the companies, they need to provide the whole chain of ownership. And in Hong Kong, our arrangement does not require that. But we can still require they have to fill in the information of the natural person who has the beneficial ownership. So second, regarding overseas registered companies, in Hong Kong, for Hong Kong registered companies, they need to register the beneficial ownership, and Mr. Chow is correct. I understand that these overseas registered companies, way before this legislative work, they had already tightened up their requirements, and there has been increase in transparency of the beneficial ownership. So worldwide, there is a similar trend. And third question, I need to explain that companies, they need to keep a register. They do not need to submit that to the government or company's registrar. So in our legislation, we require that each company, so people who are potentially SCRs, significant controllers, they have to fill out the relevant information to the company, and 1 month, they are given 1 month. So when these notified people they respond back to the company and confirm the ownership, the company within 7 days has to register that information with the significant controller register. So there is sufficient time for them to receive the information and confirm that. So aside from keeping records and archives, they can hand it over to the company secretary, the unit trust, or the company service provider, or they can hand it to accountants. So we believe that these professional intermediaries can meet this 7-day requirement in a timely manner and comply with the law. Next, Mr. Wu Jiwai. And then we can move on to the second round with Mr. Leung Kai-cheung. There was another meeting. I'm not sure if my question was raised. My first question is about responsibilities, because according 653P to 653R, the applicable company has to take reasonable steps to issue a notice to identify the business entity that needs to be registered. But it says that if there is a breach, the relevant company and its each responsible officer has contravened the law. But it doesn't state who is supposed to undertake these reasonable steps. So, regarding the responsible officer, how do we understand that? Is there a clear definition? That is, who is the liable person? And second, regarding the implementation. In Annex 5B, it says that their natural person or the legal entity has to be registered, but it doesn't refer to the format of the register document. But in M, it says that under the business register, there is a place where these documents are kept, and I would like to ask, this specified document or format document, will it be provided and will it be applicable to all information that is supposed to be registered? Or do we mean that you have to keep all the relevant information and there will be a document submitted to the company's registrar and stating where the information is kept? Secretary? Thank you, Mr. Wu, for your two questions regarding 653P. The responsible officer under the company's ordinance, they have to keep the information regarding natural persons and the board of director members and managers. So that is already in existence in the company's law, company's ordinance. Now, regarding the specified document, the company's registrar will issue guidelines. Just now I mentioned that the company's registrar has drafted its first draft, and they are consulting the industry. There will be a specified document allowing the company officers to fill in this information. Mr. Leung Kai-cheung. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask a concrete question, because we came across a case like that. Some company service providers, they are not Hong Kong companies, they are overseas or even mainland registered companies, but they inform third parties that they provide company registration services. So I can disclose the name, Japanese residents, and the Japanese consulate in Hong Kong and other news media had reported on this, and I was asked to look into this case. But they did not comply with the AML procedures. They used real names, but these people did not give their agreement, and these people were made company directors. So these so-called victims realized that their names were included in the company board of directors, and through the Japanese consulate in Hong Kong, they had highlighted this problem. So that's a very unique case. So I want to ask you, you are now regulating companies registered in Hong Kong, company service providers, and you want them to comply with AML regulations. But if some institutions are not registered in Hong Kong, but if they try to do business in Hong Kong, what regulations or ordinances do you have to make them, to have these service providers be regulated? Thank you.
DS or the registrar? Well, I have to first make clear the scope of our regulation. For those who engage in businesses as service providers for companies, there will be a licensing regime, so the business has to be run in Hong Kong. One of the considerations is, one of the criteria is business registration in Hong Kong, and that it is a business, operating business. We don't include companies registered overseas. Let me add something. Sorry for the interruption. These companies registered overseas, they may run a business in Hong Kong. They may not be registered in Hong Kong, but they will hold themselves out as running a business in Hong Kong. So, in a way, they can be seen as a service provider here. I think it depends on the facts, whether the business is actually run in Hong Kong. What I'd like to say is that we don't want duplications in regulation. If there are cases when we think that there is an element of fraud, then we will look at other provisions. Depending on the situation, we may follow up. Perhaps I will defer to the registrar. Clause 25 or Section 25, when we define company service providers, we define them as a business providing company service to a third party. So if they provide this business in Hong Kong, it doesn't really matter where they are domiciled, they will be included in the regulation. So we look at the facts, whether they provide this service to a third party in Hong Kong. All members have asked questions. Now, is any other business? We will have to make arrangements for a public hearing. Perhaps we will hear from the Secretariat. 30th of October, 4:30. And who do we invite? I hope that there will be a notice on the LegCo website to let the public know. We will send invitation letters to district councils. And in relation to solicitors, accountants, real estate agents, and trust or company service providers, we'll send invitations to them. October 30th is a Monday, 4:30 in the afternoon. We will issue notices as soon as possible. Public hearing will take place on the 30th of October. The DS will not be with us. Someone will take over from her. We will liaise with the Secretariat about the date of next meeting. We hope that we will be able to finish the scrutiny of this bill within the designated time. There being no other business, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much.